Mark Few compared new Zag Ismaila Diagne to Ronny Turiaf, gave an update on Steele Venters, and shared his thoughts on the new teams joining the WCC. And we break it all down on today's Locked On Zags podcast.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Thursday, and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Folks watching on YouTube, not a Boston Celtics fan. I know they just won the championship. This is a Kelly Olynyk jersey. We are going to talk about Kelly a little bit later in the show, but the main headline for today, Mark Few, he spoke to reporters for about 25 minutes, had a press conference before he heads off to Paris for the Olympic Games. Listened to the press conference, pulled my favorite quotes. We're going to talk about all of them today. We're going to talk about what he said about the team's newcomers. We're going to talk about what he said about how the team navigates the NIL and the transfer portal era, his thoughts on the ever-changing landscape in college athletics. We're also going to talk about the new teams in the WCC. Mark Few had not a lot of quotes about conference realignment, but a few and some body language stuff that we're going to talk about a little bit here. So we're just going to get into all of that for today's show, all about Mark Few's press conference. I want to give a special shout out to Theo Lawson, Jim Meehan, and the rest of the folks at the Spokesman Review. The press conference is available on YouTube in its entirety, all 26 minutes. I will post a link in the show notes on audio and video platforms so you can hear the entire raw interview or press conference with Mark Few there. They did a fantastic job, asked a lot of the questions, so I want to give them a shout out before getting into this conversation. So here's the first segment. We're going to talk about Mark Few's quotes on the newcomers, as well as Steele Venters, as well as a nice quote about the returning players on this roster. Start with Ismaila Diagne, because that was the first question that was asked to Mark Few during the press conference. It had just happened that he was confirmed on the roster. Mark Few said, quote, on Diagne, I think he's going to run the floor great. I think he's going to be a great rim protector. Reminds me of Ronny Turiaf, got a great attitude and a real positive energy. He's something different. So I do think the Ronny Turiaf comparison was slightly more about like personality-wise and just energy and enthusiasm type things, but they're both similar size, obviously both international prospects. Ronny from France, Diagne is from Senegal, but has been playing in Spain. Sounds like there's a lot of optimism around the future for Ismaila Diagne. I think the big question with Diagne is going to be how long until he starts really contributing. We're not expecting him to be a big contributor next season. Is it the year after that? Is he a two and done guy? Does he spend all 4 years at Gonzaga? Those are things we don't know. Obviously, Mark Few doesn't know the answers to those either, but it sure sounds like a player that Mark Few and the staff is really excited about his future. You don't toss around Ronny Turiaf's name unless you're pretty excited about what that player is going to bring to your program. Few also had great quotes on Khalif Battle. I'm just going to read it right here. He says, quote, Khalif is going to help us a bunch. The best thing we did during this offseason is we added pieces that bring different aspects to the program that we don't have. His ability to get fouled is at the highest level, I think, in college basketball. Yeah, Khalif Battle had, I think, like 60 more made free throws than Graham Ike had free throw attempts last year, and Graham Ike led Gonzaga in free throw attempts. Part of this is Khalif Battle just has a freakish amount of free throw attempts, free throw makes. He was elite at getting the free throw line. And part of it, as Mark Few alluded to, is that Gonzaga, that wasn't really an area of strength for them last year. The personnel with the smaller guards, I think they didn't have a lot of guys who bully their way to the rim and try to draw contact and get to the free throw line. That's just not really an area that last year's roster construction really allowed them to utilize very much. And Khalif Battle, Mark Few kind of went on in this quote. He basically said he's a different body type, a different kind of figure than what they've had on the wing in the past. And he's absolutely right. Battle's not very tall, but he's thick, he's sturdy, and he's a hellraiser at getting to the basket and getting into guys and trying to get to the free throw line. And that's an element that is going to make opposing defenses have to worry about that, in addition to the outside shooting that other players in the team possess, and in addition to dealing with Graham down low and Ryan out on the perimeter. So I think Battle is going to be a guy who really can contribute in ways that the Zags didn't have last year. And that's what Mark's alluding to with this quote here. We also talked a little bit about Michael Ajayi. He said we had great communication, referring to the time that Ajayi was still going through the draft process. Mark Few also said, quote, he made a great decision. Totally. Of course, Mark Few is going to think that, but so do we, right? Going on, Mark said, everybody was on the same page and he was able to get some great feedback and some great experience. Now he's back here and has a couple practices under his belt. and he's doing great. This was the best case scenario with Michael Ajayi. Something we talked about a lot on the podcast was him going through the process and returning to Gonzaga is going to be a net benefit for Michael Ajayi and a net benefit for Gonzaga. And that's what Mark Few is alluding to here. He got feedback, not just from the combine, but also from his individual workouts, which I think is a part of this conversation that doesn't get talked about a lot. And we didn't talk about it a ton too, of like, yeah, the combine's great and getting that feedback at the combine is huge, but the specific feedback from individual workouts, he got to go up against, compete directly one-on-one with other players in this draft class and see, where he thrived against them, where he maybe didn't thrive against them, got that direct feedback from coaches. Again, Ajayi was in Toronto the day of the NBA draft deadline. Obviously, he returned to school, but he was literally getting feedback up until the last possible minute. And there's just no way in my mind that that's not a big benefit for Michael Ajayi, for Mark Few, for the Gonzaga Bulldogs heading into this season. He talked a little bit about Emmanuel Innocente, basically just said, yeah, he's still in Italy, and then kind of moved on. So I wouldn't read too much into that, but just didn't have a lot of takes on Innocente. But he did mention Braeden Smith and says, to his credit, I think he sees the big picture and made a decision to go in with that being the plan, of course, referring to Braeden Smith redshirting this upcoming season. Again, another guy that seems like there's a lot of excitement about him, and Mark Few didn't spend a lot of time talking about Braeden Smith, but acknowledged that, they had a lot of great communication and that they were talking about what that plan was that they had for him. And he was happy to hear him kind of look at it from a big picture perspective and value that plan and decide it was the best option for him. Mark Few also talked about Steele Venters, and I think that's an important one, obviously, as we wait to get some updates on where Steele Venters is at. We talked about Steele a weekish, 2 weeks ago. There was a great article again by Theo Lawson at the Spokesman Review, kind of getting an update on Steele Venters' injury. And Mark Few provided another one, which is a bit of a non-update. I'll read what he said here. He said, quote, "He's definitely on track. Sometimes when you get these injuries, this is kind of the danger zone where they are feeling good, but they aren't quite ready to go, but you feel like you're ready to go. Josh, our trainer, and him have done a great job. He's shooting full speed and stuff, but he's not cleared to practice yet." Yeah, I've heard about this too. I have a buddy who's an athletic trainer, and there's definitely a period of time where you start to feel like you're 100%. You're moving pain-free, and you're like, I can ramp up, I can go. And high-level athletes, they're wanting to ramp up and go as soon as they possibly can. But just because you're feeling better and the joints and the ligaments are pain-free and they're not swollen or whatever, doesn't mean that you're cleared to go. And it sounds like the Zags are taking every precaution here to make sure they don't push Steele back early. And why wouldn't you in June? There is absolutely no reason to push Steele Venters at this point. Just doesn't make sense. If 2 months from now he's still feeling really good, you can start to kind of push him a little bit more. But even then, that's still only early September. You want him to probably be going full speed by around then, certainly by October, if you want him fully ready for the start of the season. But there's no need to push him now. And it sounds like he's perfectly on track with where they want him to be. Few didn't specify if he's going to be ready for the start of the season or not, just that he's on track. We don't know what exactly he's on track for, but I think reading the tea leaves here, I think the plan and just knowing the timeline on ACLs generally, the hope is that he is ready to start contributing right away when the season begins. But again, they're not pushing him any sooner than that. And I think that's the smart move here. Mark Few also had a nice quote about the returning players on the roster. Obviously, he got asked a lot of questions about the newcomers, but somebody asked a question about, like, what does it mean to you, to this program, to have had all these players come back when they didn't necessarily have to do that. And Mark Few said, quote, "That's the key, retention. I think this group of guys deserves a ton of credit for staying together and not just jumping in the portal for the heck of it." And I love that quote, just for the heck of it. And he went on and kind of mentioned, like, a lot of guys are trying to up the price, and he's glad our guys stayed focused and have a common goal and wanted to get to that together. And I think we talk a lot about roster construction in college athletics, and you certainly see other programs that are adding 8, 9, 10, 11 guys in the transfer portal year after year. A lot of them are coaching changes, which makes sense, but it's just not sustainable to be rebuilding entire rosters year over year. And I think the model of success is using the transfer portal to supplement areas where you need additional depth, or like Mark Few talked about with Battle, bringing in guys who bring something to the roster that you don't have with the core group you have, which makes sense. You have a core group of 4 returning starters, multiple returning depth options, and you think, okay, what is missing out of this group? and obviously you needed to replace Anton Watson. But Mark Few also said we need somebody who can, drive to the basket, get to the free throw line. So they go get a guy in Khalif Battle who can do that. They wanted a bigger body rim protector type, and they wanted a developmental big. So they go get Diagne, and then Mark Few just, because he can, he also cleaned up his backcourt for the future with Braeden Smith and Inocente. But the ability to do that, all of that is predicated on your core pieces voluntarily choosing to return. And as much as we want to give credit to Mark Few and the staff for the offseason that they've had, the players they've brought in the portal, which we should, and we do on the show, we give them their flowers. None of this happens without the key core group for Gonzaga returning. And I think it's very important. And he did a good job of acknowledging that. And I want to do a good job of acknowledging that too. This doesn't happen without Nembhard and Hickman and Graham and Ben and all those guys choosing to return for another season with Gonzaga. Well, Mark Few said he hasn't thought much about Grand Canyon or Seattle U. Said he's just trying to get through day to day with USA basketball. Don't blame him there. But he did make his feelings about Washington State and Oregon State pretty clear. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. Right after I tell you about today's sponsor, eBay Motors. Folks, passion, drive, and patience, that's the formula for winning championships, and it's also what helps keep your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors has everything that you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers to roof racks, exhaust kits to LED headlights and more, whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. Plus, with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll always find exactly what you are looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or you get your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home that W. So folks, keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. And eBay's Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, and we are still going through the transcript of Mark Few's 25-minute press conference before he heads off to Paris for the Olympic Games. We're going to close the show talking about some of his thoughts on being a coach for the Olympics, working with the coaches with that staff, and some of the fantastic things he said about that. But what I want to do now is talk about a couple quotes he had on conference realignment, as well as some quotes he had about NIL, the new era of college athletics, and kind of how Gonzaga has navigated that space. We don't get to hear Mark Few talk about this very often. Mark Few is also very careful with what he says. He is a master of coach speak, which is basically saying a lot of words that don't actually say a whole lot. As somebody who's been to a lot of press conferences, particularly somebody who covered Pete Carroll for 2 years. Pete Carroll was the master at sounding enthusiastic and saying a whole lot. And then when you look at your quotes later, you're like, well, he didn't really say anything. Mark Few is pretty good at that as well. But the body language in particular, when talking about conference realignment, I thought was pretty notable. Reporter asked him about Grand Canyon and Seattle U joining the conference next year, adding some depth to the WCC, what he thought about that. And Mark Few was very honestly said, I haven't really thought much about it. That's what he said. He said he kind of made a joke afterwards of like, I'm focused on USA basketball. I'm just trying to get through every day, etc. And he kind of used that same answer when he was asked about like a retirement timeline. He's like, I don't think about that stuff. I don't think about 5-year timelines, 10-year timelines, whatever. So he wasn't trying to be super dismissive, but he was also clear. This is not something, and I believe him. I don't think he's lying about that. I don't think that he has spent a lot of brain capacity thinking about Grand Canyon or Seattle U. I do think that he has an opinion about Grand Canyon and Seattle U joining the WCC. And I think that he was intentionally did not share said opinion about those two schools joining the WCC. But I also believe him when he said that I'm not really thinking about it, because why would he be thinking about that right now? He has bigger fish to fry currently with USA basketball, and then of course with the upcoming season. Same reporter followed up and asked about Washington State and Oregon State, who are obviously joining the conference this season and therefore should be and are more on the forefront of Mark Few's mind as he's going to face those two teams a combined 4 times this year. And his quotes about that, well, they stood out. There's a reason there was a lot of kerfuffle on social media from Washington State fans about Mark Few's quotes, because this is what he said, quote, "It certainly changed our non-league stuff. We've got a lot less non-league games, which are very important to us. Throw some Northwest teams in here so our travel won't be as bad." That is pretty clear. As clear as Mark Few is going to be. He's not particularly happy about this. And this shouldn't be a shock. It's not a shock to me. It's not a shock to most people who followed Gonzaga basketball, who know that Mark Few cares a lot about prioritizing his non-conference schedule to getting in some of those elite marquee non-conference games, getting in a 3-team MTE every year, and getting those bye games as tune-ups as well. Those are things that are very important to Mark Few and Gonzaga basketball. There is a reason that about 10 years ago, Gonzaga stopped playing Washington State in the non-conference. And that reason was publicized. They did not think it was a worthy game to continue to have on their non-conference schedule. You can agree or disagree with that sentiment. There is more to non-conference scheduling than strength of schedule and how it impacts your net ranking and things like that. Although, because of how important those things are, coaches kind of focus on that more than anything else. But the regional aspect of the rivalry, I think, mattered more than maybe the Gonzaga staff. They didn't care about that as much as I think a lot of the fans did. Let's put it that way. And now they're in the conference. And Gonzaga's going to play in Pullman. And they're going to host them in Spokane. And they're going to play in Corvallis and host Oregon State. And Mark Few kind of, I don't want to say derisively, but he acknowledged like, oh, it makes our travel easier, which it felt like a slightly dismissive way to discuss those two programs of, oh, they're close to us. Was kind of like the nicest thing that he was willing to say about Oregon State and Washington State joining the conference is they're close by. And I think that was intentional. Again, he didn't come out and say, we're pissed about this. We're adamantly opposed to it. I hate these programs. Like, of course, he's not going to say anything like that. I don't think he thinks that. But he, in his way, made it pretty clear that he would rather have 16 conference games and 2 more non-conference games than having 18 conference games. And I think that opinion would be true pretty much regardless of who was added to the conference. If somehow the WCC added 2 elite basketball programs, maybe Mark Few would change his tune on that, but they didn't. Washington State was good last year. Every player who was on last year's roster is gone. David Riley, I think, is a good coach, taking over from Eastern Washington. I think Washington State's going to be fine, but they're not going to be. They're going to be a mid-level team in the conference. Maybe they can push up to 4th, 5th, maybe 3rd. I wouldn't be stunned if they're in that conversation, but they're not moving the needle all that much. And Mark Few straight up said, yeah, they're local, which is nice, but it gives us less non-conference games. And he's upset about that. And I think that's not a surprise that that's the opinion that he had. But also not a surprise that it didn't go over very well with Washington State fans. Should make the games even more interesting this year. So I guess if we're taking a positive out of that, it would be that. Mark Few was also asked about the new era, the changing times with pay for play and NIL and transfer portal and kind of various, newness of college athletics. He had some good quotes about that here. I'll read them here. He said, quote, basically you adapt or you don't survive. And I'll insert here. I have said the phrase adapt or die on this show quite a few times recently. And when I was listening to the press conference, I was really hoping that Mark Few was going to also say adapt or die, but he went with adapt or you don't survive, which, whatever. I'll roll my eyes at that, I guess. Continuing Mark Few's quote, he said, we're pretty much a leaderless ship right now in college athletics. I hope we can get to the point where they will allow a lot of us coaches who have been doing this the right way. They just need to listen to the guys who have been doing it every day. I think we could have not been in this position, but we are now, and hopefully we can piece this thing together and get a little more structure and organization. Not a particularly controversial quote. I think that's how a lot of coaches are feeling right now is, hey, we're directionless. There's not a lot of direction. There's not a lot of rules. The rules that there are getting challenged in court, and frequently those rules are then getting upended. Nobody is steering the ship right now, and a lot of older coaches have said, I wish we'd been consulted more on this, been able to say our piece on that. And I think that's reasonable. He mentioned football and basketball because obviously it's driven by those 2 sports primarily. But again, not a quote that is particularly surprising. But again, the sentiment shared by many coaches and people in this industry of like, hey, we're not really sure the direction it's going. We're not super comfortable with it. We wish it had gone a different way, but that's the way the cookie crumbles, as it were. He got asked more specifically about Gonzaga and their ability to kind of hang in the new NIL era. And he almost cut the question off a little bit and basically said, the best thing about Gonzaga and always has been is that we adapt and are open to growth. We've navigated our way through all this other stuff for the last 25 years. I like our chances. And I thought that was a fantastic way to kind of bookend that conversation. And it's something I've kind of shared on the show a little bit too, of like Gonzaga has continued to adjust to new things in college basketball. They were ahead of the curve on international recruits. They were ahead of the curve on grad transfers. They were ahead of the curve on pursuing transfers to have them sit out and develop behind the scenes. they've been kind of continually been ahead of the curve. And I think right now they're ahead of the curve on pursuing a full 13 scholarship roster and having some of those players be earmarked for future seasons, as it were. Not a lot of coaches are doing that. And I think the ability of this staff to continue to be on the cutting edge of roster transformation in college athletics is why they've made 25 straight NCAA tournaments, 9 straight Sweet 16s. Like they're not doing that by sheer luck, or they're not doing it by just being the biggest budget school. You know, they're not doing it the way that like Arkansas football has succeeded, you know, like or Alabama football, excuse me. They're not doing it that way. And I think that because of that, there's no real reason to assume that even if they become at a disadvantage with future NIL or conference realignment, like the Zags are going to continue to survive and they're going to continue to adapt because they always have. And that's effectively what Mark Few was saying here. Well, Mark Few did spend most of this press conference talking about the Olympics, talking about his time as an assistant coach, relearning what it's like to be an assistant coach, working with the best of the best in LeBron James and Steph Curry and all of that. He also talked about the day-to-day operations in Spokane while he's gone and coaching against his former players. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, and we're still talking Mark Few and the press conference that he had a couple of days ago as you're listening to this on Thursday, talking about a whole variety of different things in this press conference, but the majority of the conversations were about his upcoming opportunity to be an assistant coach with Team USA in the 2024 Olympic Games in Paris, France. He's coaching alongside Steve Kerr, the head coach there. Erik Spoelstra, former University of Portland player, the head coach, longtime head coach of the Miami Heat. Tyronn Lue is an assistant coach there as well. And so Mark Few was asked a lot of questions about working with those guys and getting to represent the country on the national stage and various other kind of questions on that topic. And I didn't get to all of them here. Like I said, I'll post a link to the whole press conference in the show notes. Definitely check it out if you're interested. He had a lot of really good things to say about just the opportunity to represent the country and how important it is to him. But I didn't put all those quotes in here because he talked for 25 minutes, so we can't do a 30-minute show breaking it all down if we have all of his quotes in here. But he did talk specifically about what it's going to look like with him being gone in Spokane. And I'll read what he said here. He said, they've, referring to the assistant coaches, stepped up in a huge way. They're ready for that. That's the beauty of our staff is we've got guys with tons of experience. It's good for them. Actually, it's great for them to assume that responsibility, and that's what we are doing right now. It's good for them. It's good for the program because the players get to hear their voices, which is kind of how we do it here. We check in every day pretty much in some form. He also made a joke about the time zone being a bit of a challenge with that. But this is, I think, encouraging. And I think people had some concern that last offseason when Mark Few was gone for large chunks of it, working with the FIBA team in preparation for the Olympics, that, obviously last year's offseason did not go as well as this offseason. That's not even remotely a controversial statement. Last year, the team lost key contributors in Hunter Salas. They lost Efton Reed. They lost Dominic Harris to the transfer portal. Late in the offseason, Alex Tui decommitted. Caden Perry suffered a medical injury. Marcus Adams Jr. came and went like a blink of an eye. Like they added Luka Krajinovic in I think August. They added Pavle Stosic in mid-September. Like it was an insane offseason. And a lot of that people have attributed to Mark Few not being around. And there's been some conversation of players had to tell assistant coaches that they were entering the transfer portal because Mark Few wasn't there. I don't know exactly what happened last year. I wasn't privy to all of those conversations and that aspect of things, but Mark Few made it clear here that A, he's communicating with his staff every day. B, he's going to be there for the first part of summer workouts and the assistant coaches are going to take over in the second part of summer workouts, and that he has complete faith in them and their ability, and he thinks it's good for the program to hear his assistant coaches' voices. I also think him giving a lot of autonomy to his assistant coaches is good for the program for just continuity's sake when he is gone, that things continue to run like a well-oiled machine. Also, the proof is in the pudding in the sense that coaches who leave Gonzaga to go get head coaching jobs elsewhere tend to succeed. Leon Rice, tons of success at Boise State, the most prolific coach in Boise State basketball history, unquestionably. Tommy Lloyd having a fantastic time at Arizona, struggled a bit in the NCAA tournament, but for an assistant coach who'd never been a head coach, the success that he has had at Arizona is impeccable, remarkable. Roger Powell having some success at where he is right now. I'm trying to think of where it is. Valparaiso. I knew I'd get there eventually. Like the reason that those coaches have success is not just learning from Mark Few, but getting opportunities to kind of step up and take on more roles than maybe assistant coaches get to do at other places. So I think Mark Few is kind of alluding to that by saying it's not a big deal that I'm going to be gone because I'm still going to be in contact and these guys can handle it. They're here, they're experienced, they're ready to roll. This is good for them, good for me, good for the players. And I think he's absolutely right. Mark Few also had a good quote about talking about playing against former players. Specifically, he said I'll just read his quote here. He said, "It was strange last year facing Kelly. You're rooting for him, but obviously you want to win that game." He's referring to the FIBA tournament. Kelly Olynyk, of course, playing for the Team Canada. The Team Canada 20-man training camp roster was released on Wednesday, a few hours before I hit the record button here. It's going to get whittled down to 12. It's a 20-man roster right now. Both Kelly Olynyk and Andrew Nembhard are on the roster and are both near locks to be on the 12-man roster when that thing comes out. There's no reason, barring an injury or something like that, that those two players wouldn't be on that team. And Mark Few talked about that too. He said, quote, "And with Andrew on there now, it'll be even stranger. We got to win that game, but at the same time, you're rooting for those guys in every other game." And there's some other quotes too. Again, I didn't get to all of them. Domantas Sabonis, potentially playing for Lithuania if they qualify. At the time right now, unclear if Rui is going to represent Japan or not. But Mark Few is potentially going to get an opportunity to face a lot of his former players. And I think it is, he kind of talked about how, yeah, it's weird in the moment of like you're trying to beat them, but you're also rooting for them. But it's incredible testament to the program. And again, he talked about this a bit of like that there are former Gonzaga players representing multiple different countries. It's a testament not only to the success of the players who've come through Gonzaga, but the fact that they have been an international program. Not only that their players are good enough to represent their countries, but that they have had so many players come through who represent their countries. Filip Petrusev is representing Serbia. Again, Sabonis and Rui, we talk about those guys. Like, it is a huge testament to this program's success that they have internationals on the team now. Jun Suk Yeo from South Korea. Of course, they just got Diagne from Senegal. Like, they have continued to utilize international recruiting to their success. And as long as that happens, we will continue to be able to talk about multiple Gonzaga players every time the Olympics roll around, which is pretty fun. Last quote here from Mark Few. He was asked about what he takes away from being around the other coaches on that staff. Like I said, Steve Kerr, multiple-time NBA champion coach with the Golden State Warriors. Erik Spoelstra, multiple-time champion with the Miami Heat. Tyronn Lue had a lot of success at various stops as a coach as well. Mark Few's quote here, he says, "I take away tons of stuff. We incorporated some stuff last year, offensive actions, defensive actions, approaches to film sessions, everything. You get us all together in a group, and it's a great learning environment for all of us, I think." I would love to be, and he's never going to answer this, I'd be curious what things they did implement last year that they got from some of those coaches. Like, did Spoelstra tell him something that he found out would work with his personnel offensively? Like, I'm just curious. And again, I don't think we'll ever actually know the answer to that, but it's cool to know that this is one of the things I've thought about with Mark Few doing this and participating, is like he gets to be around some of the best coaches in the world. And Mark Few obviously himself is one of the best coaches in the world. And I think that there is a way that his philosophies and his teachings can impact even NBA coaches. But as somebody who runs an NBA style offense at the college level, he has a lot that he could potentially gain from them. And it sounds like he takes advantage of that opportunity and really tries to gain stuff from it. And I think like approach to film sessions is something that totally makes sense. It's like, hey, we're going to attack this a little differently this year and see if it works, see if, how certain guys might respond to a different way of watching film and kind of gaining information from that. So I think that's a really cool thing. And I was happy to hear him talk a little bit about that, because I think some of the focus on Mark Few coaching the Olympics has been negative from Gonzaga fans of like, oh, like he's gone for part of the offseason. And again, being gone last year and last year's offseason not going well, those things being paired together kind of contributed to that. And I understand why, but there's a lot to be gained from Mark Few working with these coaches and working with LeBron James and Steph Curry and all those greats on that roster. And I think he feels that, he acknowledges that. And I think it's important for us to remember too. Folks, I'm incredibly excited that I basically get to cover the Olympics this year, at least from the basketball side, men's side, women's side, with Yvonne Ejim representing Canada. It's going to be fantastic. That's going to be a lot of the coverage we get to later this summer when those Olympics roll around. So really excited to get that opportunity to talk about that. That is going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On Zags podcast, though. Be back on Friday with a guest coming on the show to talk WCC hoops. Look out for that. Back next week as we get into the NBA draft, more about Anton Watson, more about what that's going to look like for him, all coming up next week on Locked On Zags. Thanks again for listening. And until next time, as always, go Zags.